All right. Okay. So welcome everybody to our next session, which is on transforming evidence synthesis. So for those who are just joining you, my name's Matt Page. I'm the Deputy Head of the Methods in Evidence Synthesis Unit in the School of Public Health and Preventive Medicine at Monash University. And I'm really excited to chair this session, which will feature three speakers all discussing different elements of advances in methods for evidence synthesis. And what we will have to start off is Tari Turner, who is, before I introduce Tari, I'll just explain, sorry, that each speaker will speak for about 15 minutes, and we'll save all questions for the end. And then depending on the mood of everyone, we can also break up into some breakout rooms to give you the chance to speak to the individual speakers as well in the last part of the session. But as before, feel free to type any questions in the chat, which I'll be monitoring and saving for the end after the three presentations. So firstly, I will introduce Tari Turner, who is the Director of Evidence and Methods at the National COVID-19 Clinical Evidence Taskforce, leading development of living guidance for COVID-19 prevention and treatment. And she's also an Associate Professor at Cochrane, Australia in the School of Public Health and Preventive Medicine. And Tari will be talking to us all things living evidence synthesis. So welcome, Tari.
Thanks very much, Matt, and thanks for the opportunity to come and talk with you today. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Boonwurrung people in the outer suburbs of Melbourne. I want to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'm really delighted to come and talk to you today about the practice, pitfalls and promise of living approaches to evidence synthesis. By way of perhaps slightly unusual background, I've always wanted to be an astronaut. And I'm actually married to an ex-astrophysicist. In fact, a basic part of my marriage has been what my husband and I call the NASA agreement. So that is that if NASA calls at any point, which is particularly unlikely in my case, I grant you, we can just walk out, ideally, but not necessarily leaving a note to explain our absence. In my current role, directing the National COVID-19 Clinical Evidence Taskforce and developing living COVID guidelines, it's not surprising that mostly I find myself talking to people in health about health. So it's fair to say that I'm very excited and grateful for an opportunity to talk across and beyond my discipline. And today I'm going to seize that opportunity and talk about health, of course, living evidence approaches, and also rocket science. To start with health, in 2001, Professor Chris Szilagyi, who was the founding director of Cochrane, Australia, where I'm based, described what he called his moonshot for health. That every patient would have a safe and effective encounter with the healthcare system. It's an elegant statement, both aspirational and yet so very, very fundamental. 20 years later, it's a sad but undeniable fact that we still aren't there. Today, too many people still don't receive the treatments we know work, and many still receive treatments that aren't effective. 20 years on, Chris's moonshot for health is still to be achieved. The first thing I say, and most of my talks about living approaches to evidence synthesis, is that they aren't rocket science. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about why that is. But today, in a slight turnaround, I also want to use an admittedly quite tortured rocket science analogy to illuminate how living approaches to evidence synthesis can help us achieve Chris's moonshot for health, about what living evidence approaches are, about what can go wrong, and about what's possible when they go right. So to start with the practice of living evidence, what is living evidence synthesis? Put simply, living systematic reviews are rigorous, reliable evidence reviews to inform decision-making that are always up to date. Living systematic reviews, like standard systematic reviews, are a powerful tool for understanding our universe, for describing what we know and what we don't. The fact that a living review will always include all the most recent evidence is vital. Decision makers don't want reviews that tell them what we knew last decade, last year, or last month. They want reviews that tell them what we know now. The COVID-19 pandemic and the rapidly developing evidence base for COVID treatments has stridently emphasised the importance of continual updating of evidence synthesis. The idea of regularly updated systematic reviews is not a new one. And in fact, it goes back to a book published by Archie Cochrane in 1972, a book which became the clarion call for the founding of Cochrane and the catalyst for conduct of literally thousands of Cochrane systematic reviews. His latter quote summarised the challenge. "It's surely a great criticism of our profession," Archie said, "that we've not organised a critical summary by specialty or subspecialty, adapted periodically, of all relevant randomised controlled trials." Archie Cochrane's book was published in the same year as the most recent occasion on which people took a literal moonshot and went to the moon, the NASA mission known as Apollo 17. Apollo 17 is the mission on which the famous blue marble picture was taken, the picture that so powerfully demonstrated how connected and how interdependent we all are on this little blue marble we call home. In a living systematic review, all the methods of a standard systematic review still apply, and new technologies and efficient workflows are used to make the process feasible in a rapid, repeated mode. Technologies like automation and machine learning improve search efficiency. Apps like Covenants, EpiReviewer, and Slack enable online shared collaborative working, and so on. It's essentially the same process, but quicker and regularly repeated. Living guidelines take the concept of living reviews a step further. In developing living guidelines, we undertake all the usual accepted processes required to produce reliable clinical practice guidelines. We develop a scope for the guidelines, define the questions to be covered, conduct systematic searches to identify evidence to address those questions, assess the evidence, convene guideline panels of experts, develop recommendations, and publish the guidelines. The difference for living guidelines is that we don't stop there. Having produced the guideline, we continue to do all those things on an ongoing basis, continually running and rerunning the searches, assessing and incorporating new research, updating and republishing the recommendations. We often say that in living guidelines, after we've climbed the mountain, we continue to walk across the plateau. But in the language of today's talk, perhaps we might say that once we've exited the atmosphere, rather than falling back to ground, we establish a stable orbit. To give you an example of what this does look like in practice, in the living COVID care guidelines, the Taskforce team search every day for new research. We appraise and incorporate any new relevant studies into our updated evidence profiles, which are reviewed by our multiple guideline panels, which involve more than 250 clinicians. We develop new and updated recommendations as needed from this evidence and publish new versions of the guideline weekly. In the 20-odd months we've been running as a task force, we've screened more than 20,000 studies, convened more than 200 guideline panel meetings, and now have a living guideline that includes more than 150 evidence-based recommendations for COVID treatment, a guideline which has been updated more than 70 times. So what are the pitfalls of living evidence? It seems to me that getting living evidence synthesis right is all about avoiding two major pitfalls. Failure to launch, which I understand is also known technically as rapid unscheduled disassembly, and technically, and another term I've come to love technically called catastrophic re-entry or litho-breaking. Avoiding these pitfalls essentially means making sure that you can get your living systematic review or guideline up in the first place, and then maintain it in a stable orbit. And doing so requires that you have the right target, the right team, the right tools, and the right tech. In terms of target, I want to emphasize that not all questions or topics require a living approach to evidence synthesis. Living approaches are most useful for important or controversial questions where there's current uncertainty in the evidence base, and it's very likely that new evidence will be available soon. To successfully conduct living evidence syntheses, there's a sweet spot in getting the right team in place. Clearly, the team needs high-level evidence synthesis skills, And they also need a high degree of flexibility, dynamism, and pragmatism. These things don't always come in the same package. It's also important to note that funding is also vital to maintaining the work of the team over time and can be difficult to achieve in contexts where funding is usually project-based. Getting the methods right, ensuring the rigour while enabling speed, is another important element of avoiding pitfalls. The methods need to be fit for purpose, considered and streamlined, and complex is definitely not better. The urban myth about Russian cosmonauts using pencils, whilst American astronauts use million-dollar space pens, whilst false, is nevertheless instructive. Getting the technological platform right is also very important. Living evidence is not just about the tech, but it is quite a lot about the tech and about applying the tech in the right places. An online publication platform which supports multiple versions is vital, as are tools that allow effective communication between team members. I'll note in passing that your phone has quite literally 1 million times more memory and 100,000 times more processing power than the computers aboard the Apollo missions. But mostly you're probably using it to check the weather and apply filters on Instagram. So if we can avoid those pitfalls, what's the promise of living evidence? I think essentially the promise of living evidence is that we can now do what we've been wanting to do since 1972. It's now possible to produce evidence syntheses that always provide a full picture of the relevant evidence. It's now finally feasible to maintain systematic reviews and guidelines in such a way that they're always up to date, always reflect the full body of the relevant, reliable evidence. It's not hard to see how these types of approaches can be used to better support evidence-based decision-making and speed uptake of research into policy and practice. Living approaches mean that reliable summaries of the evidence and recommendations for practice are always available on tap whenever they're needed. Clinicians can be confident that the living guidelines they consult today include all the relevant evidence, haven't become outdated. Policymakers can access up-to-date evidence-based advice whenever they need it, whenever an issue becomes topical. Beyond these obvious benefits, the exciting thing for me is seeing that living evidence approaches also hold the promise that we can work together as one big team to improve decisions and their impact. I've been thrilled to see how the ongoing, iterative, refinable living evidence model allows us to enhance and build connections and collaborations between researchers, evidence synthesizers, guideline developers, clinicians, policymakers, consumers, relationships that are multi-directional and mutually beneficial. It's certainly something we're seeing more and more in the COVID living guidelines work. Over time, we've developed close working relationships with, for example, other guideline developers like NICE in the UK, with trialists evaluating COVID treatments, with policymakers enabling procurement of important drugs. The ongoing nature of the work means that these relationships continue to develop as we build our understanding of who the players are in the system and how we can enable and support each other. In conclusion, I stand by my assessment that living approaches to evidence synthesis are not rocket science, and they definitely aren't a panacea either, but they are a powerful tool in our shared endeavour to achieve Chris's moonshot for health, and perhaps in other fields too, helping us to recognise that we can work effectively together, and that when we do, we have amazing power to improve our lives and our world. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tari. What a beautiful presentation. I love all the images and really big picture perspective you've got there, and looking forward to discussing in the discussion later on more about the experiences you've had with the COVID-19 guidelines and general perspectives on where we're going forward with living evidence synthesis. So thanks a lot, and everyone else feel free to type any questions in the chat and we'll get to them as well. So next up, I would like to introduce Shinichi Nakagawa, who is a professor of evolutionary biology and synthesis at Evolution and Ecology Research Center, School of Biological Earth and Environmental Sciences at UNSW in Sydney. Shinichi's group synthesizes ecological and evolutionary evidence using cutting-edge statistical methodologies, and they also develop such methodologies for evidence synthesis. And many of Shinichi's group members are founding members of SORTI, the Society for Open, Reliable Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. And Shinichi will talk about comparing stability, variability, or interpersonal differences between groups. So welcome, Shinichi.
Yeah, thank you very much, Matt. Yeah, can you hear me? It's okay? Yeah?
Yep.
Okay, so I like to talk about today the meta-analysis comparing two groups, but not just means, variability between them. Okay. Yep, first I'd like to acknowledge my group members, past and present, and also founder. Yeah, the work I show here is done by myself and my group members. Okay, so a few years ago, we published this paper with colleagues celebrating the contribution of meta-analysis to the science in general. And this paper had this empty looking figure. The important thing is it's actually around 2021, the number of meta-analysis reaching 250,000. That's a lot of number. Actually, meta-analysis, first meta-analysis was done by early 1900s, but the name came out about 45 years ago by Jean Glass coined the term meta-analysis. Then it sort of shot up, I guess. And among those 250,000, about 50,000 meta-analysis comparing two groups using continuous variable. Okay, so 50K, that's a sort of magic number I want you to remember. So 50,000 meta-analysis comparing means of continuous variable usually use what we call standardized mean difference. Sometimes they compare the mean differences directly. They don't need to standardize, but many meta-analysis, they use different units, different methodologies, so you want to standardize. And how it looks like, it's called, for short, it's SMD, and sometimes this is known as Cohen's d or HG. And SMD, how it works, mean of treatment minus mean of control divided by the standard deviation, pooled standard deviation of two groups. It was not quite sort of accurately standard deviation, but dividing by variability of two groups. Yep, that's good. And the log response ratio, it's not often used in the medical sciences, but this is the most used meta-analytic effect size in ecology and evolution, and this is quite easy as well. And this is also unitless effect size metric like SMD. And that what it is the ratio between the treatment mean and the control mean and logged. Now, by logging it, if ratio of those means that the same value, it's 1, yeah? The ratio is 1, and by logging it, it makes it 1 into 0, and that has a really nice statistical property. And this is not the focus of my talk today. Focus of my talk is comparing the variability of two groups. How do we do it? You probably heard of a coefficient of variation known as CB. How do we calculate CB? It's a standard deviation of a group, one group, divided by mean of that group. Yeah, standard deviation of that group divided by mean of that group. And what we proposed now 6 years ago is what we call log CBR, coefficient of variation ratio. And that's easy, CB of the treatment group divided by CB of control group and logging it, yeah? And it's, the same number, logging it makes it 0. Okay, that's very good. And you remember, there has been now 50,000 meta-analysis comparing two groups mean without collecting any more data. If all those data are available, I can pick and choose from those 50,000 meta-analysis published, and I can redo it, and I can show some extra insights. And then we were wondering what should we do as a first question, even though we are evolutionary biologists, but we thought first question, interesting question to sort of facilitate take-up of the log CBR is this question, where are all STEM girls gone? Okay, more specifically, how can we explain underrepresentation of women in STEM careers, STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math? And you're kind of wondering how can log CBR can help this, but I'll show how it can help answer this question. And this study was led by the Rose, and the Rose will be giving the closing. So today, afternoon today, closing plenary. So make sure you go. She will give fantastic talk. So that's that. And what we looked at, okay, so academic performance. Looking at the literature, we realized, you probably know this, it's academic grades between primary school to high school. Usually girls outperform boys by quite a bit. However, boys have this flat distribution. So there's a boy geniuses there. And they're saying this might explain there's a over-representation of boys in the STEM, yeah? And this is called boy genius hypothesis. And it's overall, it's a mixture of STEM and a humanity subject. This difference might not be that pronounced, but according to literature, yeah, before we did the meta-analysis, this was what it was sounded like from the literature, okay? And STEM girls still do better on average, but the mean average is not as, this difference not as wide, yes? And that's why those genius boys, the high performance boys are sort of like, dominating the STEM subject. Okay, that was expected. So we used log response ratio, mean difference, and looked at log CBR, variability difference. And what did we find? Correlating 1.6 million students' school grades. And overall was exactly what we expected, yeah? So boys and girls looks like this, girls perform better, and there's some high performing boys. However, unexpectedly, in STEM subject, actually as expected, the mean difference narrowed. However, girls got more variable in a STEM, and there was not much difference there. So that's sort of like a negate that this boy genius hypothesis to explain over-representation of boys in a STEM subject. We don't know, but we came up with a couple of hypotheses. Well, we borrowed other people's hypotheses. Because of the two distribution looking very similar, this is called the abilities overlap, and the girls don't like intergender or intersex competition, so the girls are avoiding it, or abilities tilt. Girls get the school report, usually girls do better in everything, but their grade in humanities higher, so they're choosing the better subject. So that was the case study for using log CBR. Next on, so when it got published, I was pleased myself, and I was looking at this webpage, and I happened to come across this paper as well, looking at the sex difference, and it's actually mice data set, and it's 27,000 mice. It's millions of repeated measure of over 200 traits. And unsurprisingly, they showed male and females are different. Male and female mice are different. And I thought, well, we can do the log CBR, comparing variability using exactly the same data set. So we organized a workshop within our school, and we worked on this paper. And we tested two hypotheses, greater male variability hypothesis. This is the same as the boy genius hypothesis. So here, those each 4 little mountains you can see as individual, and some individual, he's sometimes smarter when he's in a good condition, but at night he might not be not as clever. So this is a within individual variation, and the greater variability hypothesis says variability within variability of male and female is exactly the same, but there's a between individual variability. Those mountains are more spread apart, okay? That's a made greater variability hypothesis. Estrus-mediated variability hypothesis is, this is the reason, like lots of biomedicine experiments avoid female rats and even like a human female subject traditionally. And this one is within female variability is much bigger compared to males, yeah, because of estrous cycle. And to cut a long story short, we didn't support any, using 200 traits, we didn't support any of those hypotheses, or each of them are supported in the particular, non sort of like organized way, supported particular traits. So again, those two hypotheses are, too simplistic. Okay, I want to quickly finish. I'm aware I have only 4 minutes. Quickly go through the 3 examples where you can use the log CBR and the log response ratio together. One example is the dopamine concentration in a schizophrenia patient. And it's really interesting. This is the axon terminal. This is how neurons communicate to each other. This is dopamine, neurotransmitter. And let's look at one. So the schizophrenic patient, their mean dopamine level is much higher than control. And this is more interesting. They found out that the schizophrenic patient, mean of the patient, non-patient, exactly the same, but the variability of schizophrenic patients is much wider. So this is log response ratio, log CBR, giving new insights. And it's actually area of psychiatry that the use of log CBR is exploding. We recently counted over 30 papers, not just schizophrenia, are using this technique. Okay, the agriculture, so the organic farming helps increase biodiversity. That's a good thing. However, compared to conventional agriculture, their productivity is less. So conventional CA, conventional agriculture has a higher yield. So comparing a mean. And also, unfortunately, conventional agriculture is more stable, meaning organic agriculture is less stable. So organic agriculture has to overcome those 2 difficulties. The last example we published recently is working with Malcolm McLeod. Some of you might know his work. So his group has been collecting lots of animal models data of the stroke. And stroke, like one of the, the known cure is a hypothermia, just cooling the stroke. And it reduces the dead tissues. Okay? It seems to work, but it increases the variability. So it means some people, hypothermia works, some mice, I guess, hypothermia works really well, but others don't. Compared to that thrombolytics, that's one of the, I think the only approved drug for the stroke. And this is just not as effective as hypothermia, but its variability is less. And variability is less is a magic wonder drug because it works for everybody. Yeah, this is where generalizability is coming in. And actually, those are other drugs, none of them be approved, but there's a lot of interesting stuff happening here. Hypothermia, we said it's a bad thing. There's a lot of inter-individual variability, but the flip side is age-personalized medicine. If you find out, for me, hypothermia works really well, that's a really good thing because it's very hard to get, drug like thrombolytics, which works, generalizable medicine. So non-generalized things are a good thing if you find out, whoever it works best. Okay, so final thoughts. Meta-analytic methods goes beyond disciplinary boundaries, just like Amos. Meta-analysis of variation gives new insights, like I have shown. And just a moment. And okay, so simultaneously examining mean and variance, that's the way to go for the future meta-analysis. And thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Shinichi. Really interesting. It's not something I've ever come across in all the meta-analyses I do in medicine. So definitely lots of ideas popping in my head now. So I really appreciate these insights. Looking forward to discussing these a bit later. Okay, so our final speaker is Joshua Polanin, who is a principal researcher in the Research and Evaluation Program at the American Institutes for Research. He's a co-founder and leader of the Methods of Synthesis and Integration Center, MOSAIC. Oh, what a great acronym. Joshua has extensive experience in quantitative methodology and has published over 50 peer-reviewed journal articles across education, criminology, public health, and methodology, including more than 20 peer-reviewed published meta-analyses. And as principal investigator of the National Science Foundation program, Effects of the Engagement, Exploration, Explanation, Elaboration, and Evaluation in Structural Model, Systematic Review, and Innovation through New Meta-Analysis Methodology, he leads a large-scale systematic review and is working to create the first open-source collaborative relational database specifically for conducting systematic reviews. And his talk will focus on creating reproducible and reusable evidence synthesis data. Now, unfortunately, Joshua could not be with us live for a very special reason, which you will see in the video recording I share. What I want to do is I will share the video and I want to make sure that, I think only Tari or Shinichi can unmute themselves. Can you confirm you see the video?
Yes, I see that.
Yes.
Oh, wait, let me stop that because I forgot to share sound. So let me do that again. Share sound. And can you hear the sound when I press play now?
Hello, welcome
Yes.
to the presentation.
Okay.
My name is Josh Polanin. I'm a principal researcher at the American Institutes for Research, and I'm excited to talk to you all today. I'm going to be talking about creating reproducible and reusable evidence synthesis data. I'm excited to be a participant and a presenter at aimos2021. It's a great conference, and I'm happy to be a part of it. I'm sorry that I can't be there live virtually. It's for a good reason. My wife is due to give birth to our second child on the day of this recording, and so I will likely be on leave. So excuse the absence, but thank you all for having me. This work has been supported in part by the Institute of Education Sciences and the National Science Foundation, both US-based funding agencies, and it really comes out of the work that I get to do 100% of my time here at AIR, and that's do evidence synthesis work. I'm fortunate enough to be the principal investigator of multiple ongoing large-scale systematic reviews and meta-analyses, and I'm also the co-director of the Methods of Synthesis and Integration Center, or what we call MOSAIC, here at AIR. And together, each of those projects and my role as co-director of MOSAIC has led me to thinking about and developing some guidelines and some information around creating reproducible and reusable evidence synthesis data. So let's get into the presentation. So what's the main takeaway and what's the main idea for the presentation? So the thesis here is something we all probably know and are familiar with. That's the idea of transparency and reproducibility. And it's one that meta-analysts often preach as we're doing systematic review and meta-analysis work. And it's a refrain I hear quite often from new staff coming to synthesis work in particular. Essentially, that primary research could do better in terms of reporting their design information, their participant information, certainly some of their summary data. I think we probably all agree that's a place for an improvement. But that led me thinking a few years back to whether or not we practice what we preach. In other words, how well do meta-analysts report their information? How well do we make sure that our data is reproducible and reusable? So this presentation is really built around a couple of things. How well are we doing? And what evidence do we have to suggest whether or not we're doing well? And if we're not doing as well as we'd like, what can we do about it? So let's get into it. Okay, so how are we doing to start with? So let's start with some extant data, and I should note at the top here a couple of things. There have been a couple of other papers to look at similar ideas to what we've done in different sectors. I primarily focus in the social sciences, and I've done some work in psychology in particular. So we're going to focus at least on these couple of slides in the social science psychological realm. And so we did a review of 155 meta-analyses published between 1997 and 2018. Two researchers on this team independently reviewed each meta-analysis, as it says there. And the video is hiding this a little bit, but we published the results of this review just last year on the Perspectives on Psychological Science. I believe now it's a fully published paper. That citation is just slightly out of date. And what we did is within each one of those reviews, we extracted information around all sorts of transparency and reproducibility issues related to the meta-analysis. And there's a couple of really important points that we use to set the context for how we're doing and where we need to go. The first is the good, and that circled section there in the top right-hand corner illustrates a piece of information that had indicated that there's a high degree of reporting. So these are things like how well the meta-analysts report their eligibility criteria, some of their how they went about searching and screening, how well they report the type of effect size they calculate. Everybody's very good about reporting what type of effect size they calculate, or at least what they intended to calculate. So that's the good news. The bad news is you can see there's some sort of middling things that we need to get better at, but then there's some things really far on the left-hand side of this graphic, and those are things like how often authors say they use a protocol, how well they report the data that they've collected, and if they present any supplementary, any statistical code to address what they've done in their analyses. And in each of those three categories, it turns out that we aren't doing very well, frankly, as a field, or at least we have a lot of room for growth. Now, some of this can be attributed to the fact that many of these studies, or at least a portion of these studies, were conducted prior to anyone really thinking about this topic or talking about it too much. Some of these were published, as you can see, in the late 90s and the 2000s. And the next slide actually highlights, kind of summarizes all of this and shows us that actually over time, we are getting better as a field at reporting all of this information and being more transparent and open with our data. And so each bullet represents a different, or excuse me, each dot represents a different meta-analysis in our database. And we've just said, okay, what's the percentage of these items that you reported, yes or no? We sum that up, and then we plotted that across time, and we're certainly getting better at reporting. It just turns out there's some things that we need to do even better at. So that leads us to the second part of this conversation is, what do we need to do as a field to really embrace this idea of transparency and reproducibility and reusability of our data? And so I've listed three different ideas here. They map on directly to what we found in the study that we just did, that I just reported on. And that boils down to creating protocols and posting them somewhere, creating raw, cleaned, and analytic data files and posting those somewhere, and then creating one-click cleaning and analysis code files, and then uploading that information to a publicly available site. So let's dive in to all three of these ideas and talk about where and how one would go about doing this. Okay, so the first one, creating a simple protocol and post it to, pick your favorite place to post it. Quite frankly, it doesn't matter at this point where we're at right now, given how infrequently people choose to, authors choose to create and then publicly publish a protocol when conducting an evidence synthesis. Really, the location of where you're publicly posting that information shouldn't make a difference. We just need them to post it somewhere. Protocols are really great at a couple of different things. They create a permanent record of what the review teams plan to do. They ensure that the findings can be trusted. So what I mean by this is if there's a record that the authors had planned to do X, Y, and Z, and then they do A, B, and C, we should be a little suspect of why those authors chose to do something different. Now, there might be a perfectly reasonable explanation, and those authors will have an opportunity, do have an opportunity in the published paper to explain why they changed from their protocol. But you can certainly trust them a lot more certainly trust the findings a lot more if the authors ahead of time said, hey, we plan to do this, and then they actually do it. Protocols also promote transparency, and then that emphasizes it all the way through the process. I don't know if there's any great data on this idea, but intuitively, it seems like if you're upfront thinking about transparency, then you're very much likely to do it all the way through the process. And finally, this posting of a protocol gives you literally an online space to do the things that we're going to talk about in the second and the third pieces of the presentation. Okay, so that's one. Create a simple protocol, post it somewhere. I should mention that the picture on the right is a protocol that I helped develop with some of my colleagues, Lisa De La Rue, Dorothy Espelage, Terry Piggott. We wrote it and published it on the Campbell Collaboration, which is a fantastic organization dedicated to producing systematic reviews and evidence syntheses. You could also easily write a protocol and publish it on Open Science Framework or just a project website. There's really the opportunities are endless at this point. All right, what's the second one? Creating raw, cleaned, and analytic data files with the data codebook and posting it, again, somewhere publicly like OSF or possibly ICPSR, which is the University of Michigan's data repository site. And so on the left here is a screenshot of a project that I recently completed. It's a systematic review meta-analysis on cyberbullying programs, so programs to decrease cyberbullying. And we tried to follow this directive, or a lot of actually this work that I'm presenting now comes out of us trying to promote the idea of data sharing and data transparency. And so on the Open Science Framework project page, you can see on the left-hand side of the screen there that data folder, O2_data, that lists several different CSV files. So CSV is a type of a data set file. And there are three in particular that we've created. There's other ones associated with citation data and some other information we won't get into. But there's three files in particular that are important. There's a raw data file, there's a clean data file, and there's an analytic data file. The raw data file is exactly what it sounds like. Whatever information you've collected from your evidence synthesis, untransformed, straight from your codebook into your spreadsheet or your database, that's the file that gets uploaded. And that gives people the opportunity, when you're thinking about use of this data, people in the future will be able to go straight to that raw data file and say, hey, here's what the original meta-analysts collected for this particular project. And that's a really powerful and useful data file to have in the future. The clean data file is where we take the data that from the raw data file, we process it, and we say, okay, here's all of the information after we transformed our variables and calculated our effect sizes and taken that sometimes messy data file and sorted it into something that is usable for the analytic data file. And the analytic data file could be the same as the clean data file if you just used all of your data, everything you've collected, you're going to use. But sometimes it differs. In fact, it often differs, especially if you're going to subset your data, if you're going to eliminate columns. That analytic data file is a little bit more of a condensed version of your clean data file and allows for easy reproducibility of your findings. If you're interested in finding any of this, the link at the bottom here is the direct link to the Open Science Framework page. Yeah, I suggest trying this out. It's actually quite a bit easier than you would anticipate. What is a bit more difficult, I will say up front, is creating something like the GIF I'm showing here, and that's reproducible code or one-click code. So one-click code is where you write all of the steps out for the data processing, for the data cleaning, for the data analysis, and then articulate which sections of the code, which chunks of the code translate to table 1, table 2, table 3 in your final paper. This is becoming the standard workflow, especially in primary research, and especially if we think about peer review, so it's good practice anyway. But future meta-analysts will know exactly what you've done, and I'll be honest with you, more importantly, is the future evidence synthesis in you that can now rerun the analyses and conduct the additional analyses that you need to do because you know exactly what you've done. And so that's a really powerful tool. Okay, just summarizing here. How do we go about creating reproducible and reusable evidence synthesis data? So first, we have to be mindful about the data that we collect, and we have to be as mindful as primary researchers have been talking and thinking about for some time now. We've gotten better as evidence synthesis over time, as the evidence from Psychological Bulletin would suggest, but there's things that we can do to be even better. Things like creating protocols and posting them places, creating different data set files and posting them to publicly available data sets, and then posting your code when you can. And then really the last takeaway here is we should be as mindful about future data use and for the field in general as we are about our future selves using our own data. Sometimes we say, or when I'm teaching this information, I say that you're writing code not for yourself in the present, you're writing code for your future self. So keep that in mind as you go along. Again, I'd like to thank everybody for attending. I so wish that I could be more a part of this conference and talk to you all. There's a possibility that I'm recording this and that I will have the opportunity to jump on for the conversation and for the question and answers. But if I don't have that opportunity and I don't get to say hi to everybody, thank you for attending. Thank you for the well wishes that I've received from some of our colleagues already. And I look forward to talking to you all in the future. If you have any questions about anything I've presented, all of my contact information is up here. My email is the thing that I respond to most quickly. But if you'd like to get in touch some other way, here's some other ways to do that. And check out Mosaic if you're interested to learn more about what AIR is up to in the evidence synthesis world. All right, thank you. Have a great rest of the conference. Have a great rest of your day wherever you are. I look forward to talking to you in the future.
Okay, so for those who might have joined midway there, that was a recording from Josh, who I'll look at the participant list. He has not, no, okay. So he has not been able to join us because he's looking after his newly arrived baby. Hopefully the safe arrival of the baby is happening today. So what I will do now is I'll allow people to unmute and allow people to unmute themselves and start their video. And so now we have time for questions to the speakers who are here. So Tari and Shinichi. I noticed there's one question in the chat already from Judith, which I think Tari could maybe give some perspectives on. Judith, did you want to unmute yourself and pose that question?
Hi.
Hi.
So the question starts with a remark. Standard Q values and confidence intervals are no good in sequential updating. And I know that in Europe and at Cochrane, this debate about replacing them in living systematic reviews has receded a bit since a Cochrane Scientific Committee advice of 2018. And I wonder, how is this elsewhere in the world? And do you maybe also know how this debate is at the Campbell collaboration?
Thanks, Judith. I'd love to hear from others on this question too. So you're quite right. So in 2018, the Cochrane Scientific Committee advised that we don't need to adjust for multiple updating and living systematic reviews. So there's no change to the official methods for meta-analyses within living systematic reviews. But I actually don't know how it is at the Campbell or elsewhere. So it'd be interesting to hear from others if they know.
Are you aware, Tari, if Campbell are currently even doing living evidence synthesis?
I couldn't comprehensively say one way or another. It feels like to me, Matt, pretty much everybody is doing living systematic reviews in the last 12 months. There's been a huge upswing in the numbers of living systematic reviews, but I couldn't say conclusively one way or another.
On this topic of living evidence synthesis, Tari, so I mean, there's been some research into the use of systematic reviews in decision making by clinicians and patients and other end users. Have you found, or have you done any work to look at what the sort of level of uptake is of living guidelines, and especially the COVID guidelines you've been doing, the living synthesis you've been doing on that topic, and what sort of perspectives do they share about living evidence synthesis? Are they enthusiastic about it, or find it hard to sort of deal with possible changing recommendations and all that? If you have any insight into that, that would be helpful to share.
Yeah, great question, Matt, and thanks. And good timing for the question too, actually. We have a publication out this week in Journal of Clinical Epidemiology looking at the impact of the COVID-19 living guidelines. And I'll put some links in the chat in just a minute to that and the stroke paper. We also have an evaluation of the stroke guidelines that's soon to be published as well. It was interesting, you know, it's pretty early days for understanding the impact of living systematic reviews and living guidelines. And there's been a lot of conversation around that there might be some potential concerns from decision makers around, you know, what if this says something tomorrow and those kinds of things. However, the evaluations really don't show that. The people are just kind of really excited by the fact that they can be confident that whatever they look at today is completely up to date. And particularly in the context of COVID, where there are literally more than 1,000 studies published every week, knowing that somebody else is keeping up to date with that flow of evidence and that they don't have to, has been a real sense of trust and reassurance, I think, creating confidence, particularly for clinicians. At the beginning of the COVID outbreak, there was very much a sense that people didn't know how to manage COVID patients, and that they were very concerned, even if they weren't currently seeing COVID patients, that when they started seeing patients with COVID, they wouldn't know what to do. So just knowing that if that came about and when that came about, they could go to a single source and find out the information they needed to provide care, which would be based on the evidence available as of that day, just provided a real sense of trust and reassurance that people have really appreciated.
Good to hear.
It's also probably just worth noting too, sorry, that we have had some concerns about people expressing a concern that living recommendations might flip-flop, might recommend one thing today and another thing tomorrow. And it's early days for our analysis of this, but both in the living stroke guidelines and in the living COVID guidelines, we're just not seeing that at all. So we see a general progression where there might be an original recommendation, which is like only use this treatment in research, and then it gathers, as the research gathers strength, we then say consider use of this recommendation, and then as further research becomes available, we say use this. But that kind of pathway seems to be pretty consistent. I'm sure there will be exceptions over time, but at the moment, we're not seeing recommendations walking back in the other direction, which is quite reassuring too.
And just before I allow Shinichi to ask a question, just following up on that point and drawing on the previous presentation, a previous presentation yesterday, can you share what the sort of recommendations around ivermectin were with your living guideline today fluctuate as much as the systematic reviews seem to fluctuate?
Yeah, happily no. So we've had a recommendation that ivermectin only be used in the context of research and in ethically approved randomized controlled trials. That's been our recommendation since day one, and it remains our recommendation today. And we would love to see some high quality research any minute now.
Yeah. All right, Shinichi, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I have a question to Tari. Yeah, thank you very much for very interesting talk. And as you said, like probably everybody's now trying to do, I guess, living systematic reviews or guidelines. And our, my group have started, and I'd like to get some advice, or whether you came across a situation that how are you organizing team? Can anybody who's done the research in this area can join, or whoever interested to join? How does it work?
Yeah. So in the context of the COVID work, Shinichi, we've been quite fortunate. We've got funding from the Australian government and previously from the Victorian state government, as well as philanthropy. So we were able to draw on people who were working within the Cochrane Australian team who had good evidence synthesis skills and could rapidly kind of, I think the word that we all used was pivot. We have quite a geographically distributed team. So we have people right across Australia who are members of the evidence team, and we've actually never all met in a face-to-face or in-person meeting. We're hopeful that the Omicron variant doesn't stop us from having Christmas lunch together next week, but we'll see. So I think it really has been a combination of, you need the evidence synthesis skills for sure. I think too, there's a kind of a cultural or personality element too. You have to be willing to deal with uncertainty and move quickly and have things change underneath your feet, particularly in the context of the living guidelines, which are literally updated every week. It's not like a systematic review project that you might be expecting to roll out over 12 months or that you can plan in that way. So it needs both of those things. It's also really important to note that for the COVID guidelines, and indeed for any evidence-based guidelines, of course, nobody with a conflict of interest can be involved in the evidence synthesis or the decision-making process. And for all the reasons we all know, it's really important that we're clear about that. So for the COVID guidelines, we actually have an international conflicts of interest committee, which reviews our panel membership as well as our team conflicts.
That's really interesting. I'm also interested in, have you invited, the group will be invited those researchers by emailing them, or have they, some of them contacted you? Oh, that sounds like pretty interesting. I have a skills, and how do you make sure sort of diversity and all those elements? Because, some certain personality will write to someone like me with just oh, hello, well, that sounds really interesting. Can I be involved?
We'd love to have you, Shinichi. Please put up your hand. I think it has been a little bit of both. So we have gone out through our networks and said we need people, and we need them now. We need people who are available, at the end of the week, and particularly because it's all kind of quite short contract work. So we haven't been able to employ people for long periods of time, so secondments and contacts of contacts have been really helpful. But we also have employed people who through an open call, and had people who come to us and been employed those ways. So it's a bit of both. But I think now we're kind of starting to get more confident about, we know where the general lay of the land is for COVID, and starting to reach out a bit more to make collaborations with other people who are working in this space, and to feel like we can keep our heads above water and start thinking about some of the more complex issues that we can build methods around, rather than just doing the day-to-day churn of looking at those studies every day. I can see, sorry, yeah. I can see Judith's question in the chat. Matt, should I answer that question?
Yeah. I think if you already had to read through that, go for it.
Yeah, so Judith, this is a great question. So the question is around the collaboration with clinical trialists and whether it's possible to use meta-analysis to inform the design of new trials and improve efficiency and reduce waste. I think this is a really important role for systematic reviews, whether they're living or not. We are starting to make research recommendations from the COVID guidelines based on where we see gaps in the evidence. The COVID situation is a little bit different because it's so rapidly evolving and many trials we know are coming, but we are certainly identifying areas where we think new trials need to be conducted. I think there's been quite a lot of work done around this in sort of traditional systematic review world, where yes, absolutely, being able to say we need trials that are kind of at least this size that are going to give us more sense around the precision of these estimates. And it'd be great to be able to develop more methods for those in the context of living reviews too, but we're just playing with the idea really at this point.
I've got a question for Shinichi. This might just sound a bit naive because it's still a bit unfamiliar to me, but this whole concept of calculating the log CVR and presenting these distributions, do you have any, I mean, I don't want to say similar to how we have rules of thumb for Cohen's D, which we know are problematic, but are there similar sort of rules of thumb, for want of a better word, for how to interpret whether the extent of variability is important enough and would maybe change our conclusion? Or what sort of the guides you have for how to interpret either the distributions you plot or the values you produce with this new method?
Yeah, this is an excellent question. I think we are quite lucky with, I think in medicine, people don't use this log response ratio, log CV ratio. We have another log standard deviation ratio as well, which doesn't account for. We often use CV because the mean and variance are correlated. It is known as a mean variance relationship, and we want to control, because when mean goes up, usually variance goes up, and you want to control for it. Getting back to your question, when you do log response ratio or log CV ratio, CVR, it's actually you can transform back to the percentage, because the CV of experimental group is 1.2, CV of the treatment control group is the 1, then its ratio is 20% increase. Yeah, and if you are experts, you would know. I mean, 20% seems like a huge difference. Quite often, difference will be like 5% to 10%, and most of people, I think, like Cohen's D, like we have no idea what, like, what is 0.1 or 0.2, 0.5. But for the response ratio, a ratio-based metric, we get percentage difference. So I think, people get rough idea of, what would be important. Of course, it changes depending on the field and question. Yeah.
And just another question on this approach. So I don't know what it's like in other fields, but I know in medicine we have this issue where often primary study authors won't report any measures of variation. So they'll just give you a table with the means in group 1 and the mean in group 2, and then a p-value, or just an asterisk saying it's less than 0.05. And sometimes in meta-analysis of the mean scores, we might sort of impute a standard deviation by borrowing across the other studies, or taking the most extreme, or using some sensitivity analysis to sort of look at what happens if you impute different things. Is a similar thing done in this method, or do you avoid imputing measures of variation if you don't have them with this type of analysis?
Well, another excellent question. So you are right. Quite often, SD or confidence interval or those error or variation measures missing. And that's problem for this, because we could impute, but we don't really want to impute, because that's the exact thing we are testing. So again, it comes back to, we really have to report those things. And I said like 50,000 meta-analysis I can reanalyze, and quite often, you go to those meta-analysis, they only report like Cohen's D. They don't give you that. They must have had mean, standard deviation, sample size, but they don't give you those. And I really encourage, in spirit of open science and transparency, people should start reporting all those things. And going back to I think that this imputation, and it's really interesting, I mentioned this mean variance relationship. And often this is depending on the measurement, like, lots of biological measurement which has a true zero, like height or weight and all those things. There's a very strong correlation between the log SD and log mean. It's like, we're talking about correlation of 0.95. In this case, we can impute a standard deviation really well, which hasn't been really used a lot, starting to be used. So I think paying attention to standard deviation relationship to me, not only like I'm just saying, like, you should use the log CBR if you can, but I think this relation, looking at the both, paying attention, because standard deviation usually seen as I think some of the nuisance, creates variability, in the old software like SPSS, you might remember the test of heteroscedasticity. Those are the variance difference between two groups. They've been seen as a statistically, impediment. You can't compare the two groups properly. There's a correction, but actually paying attention to those variability just as interesting as comparing means.
Yeah. Fantastic. And I see Tari, you've got your hand raised.
Yep. Shinichi, I'm interested in your reflections on where you think the biggest opportunities are for implementing the methods you're describing and what the challenges might be to getting them used.
Yeah, this is a really good question. There's a huge opportunity in psychology because most of psychology study, they do co-MD. This means, so this is the area. So medicine actually, most of them are this 2x2 contingency table. Treatment, patient died, patient didn't die. This is where we cannot really use the log CBR. There's no, the standard deviation of continuous variable. But psychology, this is a huge opportunity there. Also biomedicine, I said that psychiatry, this is exploding. I just didn't know this, I was hoping, evolutionary biologists, because we are interested in variation, they would use it. Maybe ecologists. And a couple of years ago, one of my postdocs said, Shinichi, do you know, there's dozens of psychiatry comparing a dopamine levels and neurotransmitter levels, using log CBR or log, standard deviation ratio. And that was really surprising. But the interesting thing was they actually had variance-based hypothesis in the dopamine psychiatric schizophrenic circle. They knew they become very, very unstable. The dopamine levels become very unstable. It's interesting that most of the hypothesis we test in many areas is a mean-based hypothesis. So there's an opportunity for creating, not only conducting meta-analysis, but creating what is a variance-based or standard deviation-based hypothesis. That's really a huge opportunity thinking about hypothesis and testing with those. And as I said, there's a 50,000 meta-analysis out there to be reanalyzed and get new insights.
Cool. I just see a comment from Judith. I'm very happy for you to unmute yourself and give a plug for this work and describe it a bit more if you'd like to.
Yes, this is just a comment, not really a question. So I've been following this discussion on updating meta-analysis from the statistical perspective for a few years. And I think with our group, we can add something new to that discussion and maybe even reopen it after the 2018 scientific committee advice, the Cochrane collaboration, because our new approach that we call all-in meta-analysis, so that's an acronym for anytime, live, leading, and possibly even interim meta-analysis. So it's possible to do meta-analysis on studies while they are still ongoing, when you don't know the sample size. This approach has a flexibility that was not really there in all the options discussed in 2018, and I think I think that might really appeal to people that also want to know how far are we towards a conclusion, and if we set a statistical criteria, what do we need from a new clinical trial to reach that conclusion? And I think that's a really interesting question.
That's great. It'd be really interesting to see how that conversation evolves. I think too, we'll have a nice, like a much bigger portfolio of living reviews to be able to do some analysis of now. We're aware there are a lot of systematic reviews that are not actually being, living systematic reviews that are not actually being regularly updated, but there are a number which are. So it'd be interesting to then look at the methods they've used and the outcomes they've had from those regularly updated meta-analyses and see how different approaches might come up with different results. It'd be interesting to see how that evolves. And I'm Googling it right now.
Yeah, can you maybe comment on so your own experiences, how homogeneous or heterogeneous these clinical trials were? Did they sort of look at each other's protocols and try to converge on enrollment criteria and make your job easier, or
no, they did not. I think, COVID is probably, again, an exceptional situation, right, where we've just had this massive wave of research that was designed and conducted and analysed very quickly. It has been less of a kind of evolutionary process, apologies to Shinichi, of that kind of ongoing development of research field than we would expect in most areas of health, at least. It's been very rapid fire. There was some early work done to develop a core outcome set, which was great, but that core outcome set has not been widely used in the trials. And definitions of disease severity vary widely, definitions of risk factors vary widely, and it actually has made the process of not just the meta-analysis, but even kind of developing clinically relevant recommendations very difficult because they haven't been well aligned in the research. I'm hoping that now that we're getting to a slightly more stable place, there will be a bit more of a convergence around some of that stuff. But no, I think there's just been such a flurry of activity that there really hasn't been much attempt, or at least much success in achieving that at this point. But my fingers are crossed for the next 12 months.
Thank you.
I just have another question for Shinichi, which is actually related to Joshua's presentation. So a lot of the information he was presenting, talking about the sort of low rates of sharing data, files and code. I mean, he's kind of focusing mostly in social sciences, but I mean, we can attest ourselves that it's also rather poorly done in medical systematic reviews. But I know you've mentioned in the past that in ecology and evolutionary biology that you see meta-analyses as superior to these other fields on this front. And I want to hear your thoughts about the sort of recommendations he was making, whether you guys are already routinely doing that, or whether there's anything from his presentation that could be done further in your field.
Yeah, that's a interesting question. I wouldn't say it's superior, but I think more than 10 years ago, a bunch of journal editors, there was a high profile case of not sharing data and unreproducible results. And I think that about 10 journals in ecology and evolution, they got together, they just decided and published the editorial. You have to archive all the data. Yeah, it's not just a meta-analysis or experiment. And it's like, it's not overnight. It took a year of people complaining. We don't know how do we need to, how come I have to, share the data? We have to, still work on it. Students working on it. But once it's mandated, it's just the people comply because, they still want to publish in those top journals. And this sort of like a culture spread. And now, still people try to avoid this. We are at a different level. We all archive now. But they try to make it's a little bit hard for the other people to reanalyze. They're changing the name. Metadata is not as well described. But some people, and we are evolving, some people now says, here's everything, using OSF, code and everything. It's now, we are getting in a phase of sharing a code at the review stage, and also sharing all the data, but you might say that actually you can use all the data, everything, but if you do, please do contact us, because we can probably work together, and that has happened many times. And that's I think Brian Nosek was making a similar story that he made everything available, you can do everything, but they contacted because you really need some domain knowledge to use the data. Yeah, so that sort of led to new collaboration, and that's the it's exactly the same experience for us. Yeah.
It's really impressive to see, because there's still so much resistance after many years in these other fields, and it's just seems like a success story that it was only 1 year of complaining that people just started doing it. So you guys are very special people, I think. Tari, I see your hand raised.
Thanks, Matt. I just wanted to respond to that too, and just note that whilst the experience hasn't been perfect, COVID has actually demonstrated how willing scientists are to collaborate together and to share information. I've been working in guideline development for a very long time, and really we've always talked about this kind of theoretical idea that we could develop and share evidence profiles, and that you might have different recommendations based on other elements of the grade process, but that the evidence profile in summary is pretty independent and could be shared across guideline groups, and that always seemed like a normal and kind of rational thing to do, but it hasn't been possible for reasons that I've never quite been able to get my head around. But this time we have been able to do that. So we were sharing our RevMan files and our evidence profiles with NICE in the UK, and they're developing their recommendations on the basis of those. We've cloned our guideline for the Danish Health Authority to use as the basis of their guideline, and we've shared elements of RevMan files and so on with groups in Korea and others. So that's been a major step forward for guideline sharing of content. And also just to kind of reflect that in terms of the evidence synthesis inputs, this is the first time I've been involved in a guideline program where we've used so frequently preprint data. We had to, in the early days, come up with a plan for how we deal with preprint data. Would we include it? Would we not? And now looking back, it seems like a ridiculous question. If we'd waited for publication, we would be waiting for months in many of these contexts. But that's been a big change too. And people have been much more willing to share their data. So we've gone back to researchers and said, can we get a bit more information here? They've been responsive and provided it. And we've also been able to establish relationships with, here in Australia, the therapeutic goods group in the government who make assessments for the government about whether a drug should be approved for use. They've been able to work as an intermediary for us effectively with the pharmaceutical companies to get us access to the clinical study reports. So we've had full access to that kind of level of data for a number of drugs, which has been massively helpful for us, both in terms of speeding up the process, but increasing the amount of data we have to work with too. So there've been some real wins out of the COVID experience, and I hope that they carry over into other fields.
Shinichi.
Yeah, so I just relating to that, I just wanted to ask, because medicine is the sort of like expert of guidelines, and when we started sharing stuff, difficulty is like, what's the incentives, how do we get all the credits, what is expectations and etiquettes, agreements. And I just thought maybe the, medical people are starting to think about developing guidelines for the sharing data and all those things. Have you ever come across anything like this? There's in ecology and evolution, there's been paper about some etiquette or code of conduct papers being written, but it's not really a guideline. But I thought, because medicine is so good at making guidelines, and maybe you thought about this.
That's a really good question. I'm not aware of anything, but that doesn't necessarily mean no. Our approach with the COVID guidelines has really, it's been, I think, reflective of the broader research and health community. Everybody just wanted to pitch in. Everybody was like, right, what can we do? And given we have something, of course we would share it. And I mean, that would be lovely if that kind of altruism spread more broadly across all of our work. But I think that has been specific to the COVID response. I think, yeah, I'm not aware of any kind of code of conduct, but that's an interesting thought. I wonder if the Guidelines International Network might have something. I'm not aware of that.
Not aware either.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, because that would be kind of nice because, you know, I've seen the people who's, I have discussed and negotiated with people who's unwilling to share. And if there is a clear incentive guideline, how credits, because I need to explain, you know, person by person, case by case, and sometimes they say no anyways, and it would be really helpful. Sometimes I send those etiquettes or code of conduct type papers, but I thought it would be quite useful because it, you know, I mean, COVID stuff, it's sort of like, you know, this altruism or general good is very clear. We have to, you know, work now. But you know, this, yeah, as you said, you know, this should spread, you know, the science in general, and maybe something it would be good things to think about. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right too, Shinichi. I mean, there has been, I think I said in the presentation, a sense of we're all on the one big team. Like everybody's going, what can I do as a doctor, as a pharmacist, as a nurse, as a health researcher, as a guideline developer? Everybody's like, right, where can I pitch in? Which has been magnificent. But it seems to me that should apply in all fields of scientific endeavor. We're all working together to, you know, improve the world we live in. We should all be thinking about it in that way. But maybe we just need the systems that enable, as you say, people to be recognized for contributions and to be able to kind of map the impact of their work in a maybe a slightly different way as well.
I see another question, Judith. Well, I'm happy for you to unmute yourself again.
Yes, so I was responding to Tari's remark about receiving data from pharmaceutical industry. And I interpreted that as receiving full data sets in individual patient data.
It's the clinical study reports. So sometimes it includes some IPD, but it's not, often it's still summary data, but a much more extensive summary data.
Ah, I see. Yes. And what are your experiences there on general, on trying to get it, and is it worth it? And did it help to find errors or other, for example, misunderstandings about certain trials?
So yeah, good question. I think the first thing to say is it's given us, it's reinforced our respect for the people who are taking that clinical study report data and trying to produce a 5-page summary. You know, often that's, you know, 700 pages of, you know, multiple copies of multiple different files. It's a huge amount of data. And so I think we have an increasing respect for people who can provide all the useful information, like what Joshua was talking about, that we need to interpret that data. It has been great. I think that predominantly the benefit has been that we can get to that data before it's published and before it's preprint. So the primary benefit has just been speed. We can get to it sooner. We can make recommendations that are based on the full data set. We also get a better understanding of how trials have evolved. So links a little bit to the previous session to this one. We can see what the initial protocol was, what the protocol was Mark 2, Mark 3, Mark 17. We can see how things changed as the trial evolved, which is interesting and relevant for us. And particularly because in COVID, many of the studies have both been hypothesis testing, but also hypothesis generating. We can see it's useful to get the kind of post hoc subgroup analysis data that you might not report in a main study report because it wasn't part of your protocol, but gives us a heads up about things that we could be considering for future work and recommendations. So, for example, in a number of the big trials, they've done, this is very specific, but post hoc analyses looking at seropositive as opposed to seronegative patients, which wasn't something that they pre-specified, but has actually been really helpful in thinking through, okay, this is actually a specific patient subgroup. There are big differences here. We need to look for this going forward. So I think it's been great to have that richness of data. As an evidence nerd, it would have been lovely to have the months required to delve right into the IPD, but obviously we still only have like 7 days to look at all that data quickly. So I suspect there'll be PhDs to come for many years.
Just a quick follow-up. Is this experience mainly from the pharmaceutical company data, or did you also get such detailed level data from clinical trials that are not pharmaceutical trials?
No, this has predominantly been for pharmaceutical data because it's when the companies are applying for approval from our Therapeutic Goods Association.
I think just one question I had for you, Tari, if you can share your reflections of what you think are the most important research questions to address in the living evidence synthesis space, having worked so heavily within it over the last, and so intensely over the last 20 months as well, has it generated new ideas of sort of questions that need to be solved, that are most high priority for you?
Yeah, I think about 1 million questions to be solved. More questions than answers at this point. I think there are big picture questions, the kinds of things I flagged in my presentation. There are also practical things around how do we fund this type of endeavour, how do we maintain teams, how do we deal with getting appropriate authorship, those kinds of workflow questions. I think there are really important questions around translation of the results of living systematic reviews and living guidelines into practice and policy and what that looks like over time. And the thing that's driving me right now is actually about the non-effectiveness components of living guideline development. So looking at questions around equity and feasibility and acceptability, where we've got content that's largely based on qualitative evidence syntheses, and like living qualitative evidence synthesis is a whole other thing, and it's conceptually very different to quantitative evidence synthesis. So I think, yeah, there's pretty much a whole constellation of questions to be answered over the next little while, which is great.
Yeah. I hope anyone in the audience is happy to come your way and potentially do some PhD research with you on that.
Yeah, please.
So we've got just 2 minutes left. I wanted to know, Shinichi, if you wanted to make any final remarks based on anything we've discussed today to help wrap up.
It's a difficult one, but
putting you on the spot.
yeah. Clearly, I mean, this space clearly has lots to be done. It's fascinating listening to Tari's experience about the living systematic reviews and guidelines, and Joshua's talk about those standards, and it's really good. Everything is evolving, and things will get better, and we have now this society to push things, so it's really cool. And I really hope some of you started to maybe think about following up from my talk, thinking about variability, because if you're in a medicine, drug development, my last example, area of personalized medicine, like most of stuff focus on the genetics, but actually this inter-individual variability, it's in the data, and we should take advantage of it. Yeah.
Great, thanks so much. And I see you're responding to Pavel's question there, Tari. Thanks so much. But we do have to wrap up now because we are moving on to different group discussion sessions next. So I just want to thank everyone for attending and to show your appreciation for Tari and Shinichi for being under the grill for several good chunk of time now. I think it's been a really fun session and worthwhile discussion. And looking forward to working more with you both on these issues. So next up we have a couple of group discussions, and enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.